Right, good evening. Welcome to the 30th anniversary, I'll say, of the Baker Peace Conference. We've been sort of trying to puzzle out whether it's actually the 30th, but we know that the first one happened under that name anyway, as an annual in fall 1988, when the theme was political violence in Central America. We've ranged far and wide since then, and we've landed for this year on a topic, populism, the press, the election of 2016, and also the question of populism worldwide that I think affects all our lives fairly immediately. My name's Ingo Trauschweitzer. I'm the director of the Contemporary History Institute, as well as a faculty member in the history department. And as such, I get to organize the Baker Peace Conference, that is, as the director of the Contemporary History Institute. Though I have to say this year, this is my first year on the job, and these have a sort of a long planning phase. The conference theme came pre-selected, and I very much appreciate the selection. It's terrific. And much of the program was skillfully assembled by my predecessor, CHI director Steve Miner, and also by Bob Stewart, the director of the Scripps School of Journalism. Now, you might say this is preemptive blame shifting, but it's really a kind of a sincere thank you to you both. While I'm in the mode of thanking others, I'd like to recognize Ann Baker, the daughter of former Ohio President John C. Baker and Elizabeth Evans Baker, who provided both the vision and the funds for the Baker Peace Studies program, which underwrites this conference. I've long admired Ann Baker's devotion to the conference, the program, and the university, and perhaps she's watching it on the live stream because, unfortunately, unlike in most years, she could not make it out to Athens today since her flights out of New York got canceled and there were no alternatives to be had on short notice. Thanks are also due to Connie Hunter, the events manager at CHI, without whom we'd be hard-pressed to get our speakers here on time and the whole program running smoothly. There's really a lot of logistics that go into this. I'd like to also thank the members of the Baker Peace Studies Committee, whose work behind the scenes ranges from topic selection and input of speakers to things like picking the annual fellowship for graduate students, which several people are probably trying to suss out. So we'll decide on that tomorrow. Here, thanks are due to Catherine Jellison, Nuket Sandal, John Brobst, Margot Cowden, Scott Miner, Sam Crowell, President Emeritus Charlie Ping, as well as Ann Baker and Steve Miner. And certainly last but absolutely not least, thanks to President Dwayne Nellis and First Lady Ruthie Nellis for hosting a lovely dinner, to the Nellises and the trustees for the conversation and for attending tonight's talk. So our program follows the, for us anyway, tried and tested approach of an evening keynote address to set the stage, introduce us to some of the general questions, maybe some of the finer points of the topic at hand, and get us all started thinking about the effects of populism, the disconnect between national media and some of the country, maybe much of the country, that became evident, well, glaringly evident anyway, in the 2016 election and the long lead up. And perhaps less so today, but certainly also then tomorrow, this worldwide resurgence of populism that we can see anywhere from Britain to Russia to Turkey and elsewhere. You are all invited, of course, to join us at 10 a.m. tomorrow in Nelson Commons for a sequence of panels on the national media, the regional media, and the resurgence of populism. I'm thrilled that we have Ken Stern here with us this evening to guide us towards some of these questions, or rather to guide us towards perhaps some of the answers. He is, of course, the former CEO of National Public Radio, and he's now the president of Palisades Media Ventures, a leading Washington communications firm. He's someone who's overseen a national media institution in action and in fact, in expansion. He is a graduate of Haverford College and of Yale Law School, and he began his radio career actually fairly close to home, for me anyway, with Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty in Munich, sort of Germany, I'll say, and I'll leave it at that. What particularly caught our eye was his new book, or then forthcoming book, when we made the determination. There's really two ways to pronounce this title, right? It's either Republican like me, or Republican like me. I'll leave it to him to fill you in. How I Left the Liberal Bubble and Learned to Love the Right. The book was published by HarperCollins last October. In it, Stern addresses how he came to walk that proverbial mile in the shoes of others, those Americans who many of us, I'm going to say probably, consider to be left behind by a fast-paced global economy and group of people in West Virginia, in Ohio, in Kentucky, in many other states really, who clearly voted against their own best interests, we think. And maybe he thought so too when he started on this endeavor of traveling the country and listening to people's concerns, which remarkably he did before the election in 2015 and 2016, but he came to conclude that he really doesn't anymore, and that really we as the subtitle indicates, we live in these bubbles or maybe echo chambers of our own choosing, and if we break out of them, really intriguing insights might arise. So long story short, this struck us as very close to what we wanted to explore at and with this conference. And I want to say very clearly, really not as a partisan issue, and all joking aside, really not as a condemnation of a group of voters of one stripe or another, but as a kind of a journey of rediscovery of the place in which we live. And when it comes to it, and I've been thinking about this quite a bit, in terms of living in bubbles, or in a bubble, I certainly find I'm probably guilty as charged. And the sense that if I think back to 2016, that fall, I found myself traveling the country quite a bit by car in battleground states in a quest to get to various archives. And as soon as I left the urban core of Cincinnati or sometimes the friendly confines of Athens, all I saw was Trump and Pence bumper stickers. And then I saw the polling data and I saw what the news media reported, and I said, well, this is a fluke. This is the aberration. And I expected a very different outcome. I didn't trust or listen to those who perhaps thought otherwise, my partner included, who I think still holds that against me. Why don't you listen to me? And so I'm sure that didn't just happen to me. And that many of us are wondering more broadly how we came to this moment in which the country seems so deeply divided, and much of it actually seems foreign to us. I mean, I suppose it seems foreign to me by definition, but then again, I've been here for over 20 years, so it might be fair to say us. And it is our hope that this conference will shed some light on these questions. So with that, I hope you will join me in welcoming Ken Stern to Ohio University and to the Baker Peace Conference.
Thank you, Ingo, for that kind introduction. And I got to tell you, I'm just so honored to be here at the Baker Peace Conference and talk about the issues that I can't think are more important to the country. What happened 2 years ago now, 16 months ago, in the election of 2016, the rise of populism and the role of media is about critical questions that I can think of. And I'm going to honor that title, those subjects, and the importance of them by talking about something completely different. I'm going to talk about polarization. And for me, that is the question of what you might call identity polarization, attitudinal polarization, what we think of the other side. And I think it's a critical importance and really is woven through the topics of this conference. Because what we have going on, I think, in this country is the loss of the presumption of good faith on the other side. Democracy doesn't require agreement. In fact, it is a means of reconciled disagreements. But it does, at some level, require the assumption that we are all part of the same community, the same specific dialogue. That's actually what this conference is all about. And I fear that is eroding in this country. And that's what I want to talk about a little bit about polarization in this country. And I'm going to start with the story that brought me into it. And led me down the path of this book of about 1.5 years of spending time walking in the shoes of the other side. And that story begins in a little area called Mount Pleasant in Washington, D.C. Some of you know it. It was founded about 100 years ago, oddly enough as a suburb of downtown D.C., even though it's only about 2 miles north of the White House. And it was offered as a cooler respite from the swamp, even though it's only about 30 feet higher than downtown DC. But over about, it's a lovely, it was built as a lovely upper middle class neighborhood. But over a period of years, like so many urban neighborhoods, it went into a bit of decline. White flight, the neighborhood downhill, and all culminated in the most famous activity ever in our neighborhood, the Mount Pleasant riots of 1990. 3 days of looting, burning of police cars, at the end of which, oddly enough, began the resurgence of Mount Pleasant. So over the last 20 years, there's been a gentle regentrification of the area, and it's been created sort of this nice mix. Trendy restaurants next to bodegas, big box stores not far from little shops. That's why Mount Pleasant is known quite often as eclectic and diverse. We kind of like it that way. And we are diverse. We celebrate our diversity of black, white, and brown, and all the colors of the gay pride flag. But we're not so diverse when it comes to blue and red. Mount Pleasant is astonishingly liberal. 94% Democratic registration. In the election of 2016, Hillary Clinton scored 91.5% of the vote, and Jill Stein outpolled Donald Trump 74-70. And it all seemed perfectly normal. I mean, I live on a nice street called Hobart Street. Hobart Street's a lot like the rest of Mount Pleasant, and truthfully, my house is a lot like the rest of Hobart Street. I'm a lifelong Democrat, spent time in Democratic politics. My wife is a Democratic staffer on Capitol Hill. So it all seemed pretty natural until Porch Fest. So say what you want about Hobart Street. We have a lot of team spirit. We have a big block party every Halloween. Kids come from all over. We close the street. Row houses are great very efficient for getting candy. We're sort of famous for it. But the big annual event is called Porch Fest. And we close the street. Everyone does a little bit of something. You cook, you make music, you put out slip and slide, you brew beer for the older kids. My wife, Beth, stays up all night making cookies every year, which she cuts variously into the shapes of the Capitol, the Washington Monument, and the city of DC. Some are frosted. She frosts, and she leaves others unfrosted, so the kids can go at it with tubes of frosting, which they do with a lot of enthusiasm and not much coordination. Our steps of our house looks like the victim of a food coloring balloon prank for weeks afterwards. But the highlight of Porch Fest is the parade, which is always led by the local fire department and an antique vehicle that shows up every year and then disappears again for another year. And it always begins with the Hobart Street Pledge. And I always love the idea of the Hobart Street Pledge. Not that I actually listened very carefully to it, but it was the idea of community in this atomistic society we're in. We're all over the place, people moving around on social media. Here on Hobart Street, we have a community. I loved the idea till about 4 years ago when I actually listened to the words. And I'm going to paraphrase because there's still a little bit of argument over what the words actually were. But the substance of it were, all are welcome here on Hobart Street, white or black, gay or straight, man or woman. Everyone is welcome on Hobart Street, except for Republicans. And it was a joke, but it wasn't a joke. Because like a lot of the rest of the country, it's actually not so fair to point out Hobart Street, because it's actually similar to the way we are organizing ourselves. As much as we talk about diversity, we are increasingly intolerant of the other side. We don't want to listen to them. We don't want to listen to their media. We don't want to know them. We don't apparently want them as neighbors. And the Hobart Street Pledge actually began for me sort of a quest. How could it be that we've gotten in a place in a democracy where we don't want the other side, we're not willing to listen to the other side, and we don't even want to live near them. So that began the book. It's really built around what Atticus Finch said in To Kill a Mockingbird. If you want to know someone, you have to see things from their point of view. So I spent a year and a half really trying to understand people's perspective from the other point of view, in this case, the Republican point of view. I have to say it's a little bit unfashionable to talk about that this way. I think the ethic of public conversation in this country is pretty well established by a radio show I listen to called The Will Count Majority. It's on Patriot Radio, on satellite radio. The host, Andrew Wilkow, 4 times an hour, it's his slogan, says, "We're right, they're wrong, that's the end of the story." Sort of an odd thing to have in on a talk show, but it really, to me, sort of sums up how we're beginning to think of it. Our side is right, the other side is wrong, whatever side we're on. And what I want to accomplish in the next 30 minutes or so is to really actually encourage us to actually think differently about how we got here. We're increasingly thinking about us being on the other team, and there are a series, my goal is not to convince you to think better of anyone else, but to understand that the reason, there's a danger in what is happening, and the reasons we're there for things, for trends that are probably different than you think. So I'm going to start the story of polarization in America, not with Donald Trump. It starts long before him. He's a symptom of it, perhaps an accelerant of it, but it doesn't start with him. And this story of American polarization I'm going to tell actually starts with a guy who, as far as I know, has never been to the United States. It's a guy named Henri Tajfel. Teifel, I think, is actually the way you pronounce it. Henri Teifel was born in Poland between the wars. A talented student who couldn't get into college in Poland because he was Jewish. And because of that, he had to leave the country, his home country, and move to France, where he got his college degree and eventually his advanced degrees. And the irony of the discrimination was, because he couldn't get education in his home country, he actually avoided what happened to his family and neighbors, which was Auschwitz. And Teifel, not surprisingly, spent his career thinking about, like many of his colleagues in post-war Europe, how could the Holocaust have happened? How could an entire country of people become so vicious, so evil, all in sort of one group? And that was sort of the question that burned a lot of post-war scholarship and drove Teifel's career. And he did a series of experiments which became quite known. I'm going to tell you the story of one which I call the dot experiment. He didn't call it that. I don't know if anyone's ever called it that, but that's how I think of it. So he got a group. He was by then in England, teaching England, and he got 64 kids to be part of an experiment. 64 British schoolboys aged 14 and 15. And he brought each of them into a room one by one, and he showed them a piece of paper which had a bunch of dots on it. And he asked each of them to guess how many dots. They would guess, at the end of which he told them all, "I'm dividing you into 2 teams." He told them separately. They never met each other. They didn't actually know anything about each other. But I'm going to divide you into 2 teams. One team is the overestimators. The other team is the underestimators. He actually didn't even do that. He actually sort of arbitrarily, randomly assigned people to 2 groups of 32. But he told them that they were part of these groups. And think about it. You're in this group. You just put in the most bizarre of circumstances why you're on a team. You don't know anything about your teammates. You don't know anything about the other side. And Teifel said to them, and I'll make up the dollar amounts here, or in this case, the British pounds amounts, just to illustrate. He said to each of them in turn, "You have 10 pounds. You can keep 5 pounds for your team as long as the other team gets 5 pounds as well. Or you can take a lesser amount, let's call it 4 pounds, but in that case, the other team only gets 2. And Teifel, I think, quite rightly assumed, well, of course, that's pretty obvious. You keep 5, the other people you don't know, have no reason to dislike or like, gets 5 as well. Everybody wins. And invariably, these kids picked 4 and 2. Because what was mattered to him, as he said, it wasn't about maximizing the good for themselves or others. It was about winning. And the most interesting happened in successive experiments that he and others did, which is not only they care about winning, that in similar groups they began to associate positive attributes with their team, none of whom they knew, and negative attributes with the other side, even though they were all entirely random and they're all essentially entirely identical for purposes. And from this, Teifel and others have really understood the effect of tribalism on how we perceive ourselves, how we perceive others. And it all comes out in the most fascinating set of research. And it's not just about awarding things, even how you understand facts. So there was a famous experiment done by 2 Ivy League political scientists, I think in the 60s, one from Dartmouth, one from Princeton, around a famous football game at a time when people cared about Ivy League football. It was between Dartmouth and Princeton. Both were highly ranked at the time, especially Princeton. It turned out to be a particularly violent game. One of the Princeton All-Americans went off with a broken arm, lots of penalties, lots of recriminations between the schools. The school newspapers wrote nasty things. And these two political scientists took tape of the game, and they ended up showing it to groups of Dartmouth students separately from groups of Princeton students. And they asked them how, they all saw the same tape. And frankly, these student bodies, especially at the time, were pretty darn interchangeable. And they asked them how they understood the game and what happened. And the two sides had completely different interpretations of the facts. It's not only the notion of who's better, who's right, and who's wrong. They all had their own set of facts. Think about that in terms of how we now organize ourselves and think of ourselves. How tribal we are here in the United States, around politics and elsewhere. But it hasn't always been about politics. The tribalism around politics is a relatively new invention. I always like to, how many of you have ever heard of Tom Lehrer? All right, good. I like you guys for that. Thank you. So Tom, for those of you who don't know Tom Lehrer, he's actually one of these great characters of the second half of the last century. So Tom Lehrer was a Harvard mathematician, taught at Harvard, MIT. He's actually still alive, 90 years old, living in Santa Cruz, where he last taught, UCSC, I guess. But he's not famous for his math. He's famous for writing songs. Funny songs, pointed songs, the Vatican Rag, Poisoning Pigeons in the Park, the Element Song, which my 10-year-old son Nate loves, and most relevant here, National Brotherhood Week. So around 1960, he wrote this song, which is about National Brotherhood, because the real thing started by the Catholic bishops, I think, in the first decades of the 20th century, all built around this notion that 50, as he said, 51 weeks a year, it's okay if we hate each other, but during National Brotherhood Week, we're going to get along. And he wrote this song, which I will, if I was a real showman, I would now bring out the piano and play and sing it for you, but I don't know how to play a piano, and no one wants to hear me sing. So I'm going to read little snippets of it to you. So the beginning of this song goes, "Oh, the white folks hate the black folks, and the black folks hate the white folks. To hate all but the right folks is an old established rule." And it goes on, "And all the poor folks hate the rich folks, and the rich folks hate the poor folks. All of my folks hate all your folks. It's American is national pie." And then my favorite stanza says a little something about me. "Oh, the Protestants hate the Catholics, and the Catholics hate the Protestants, and the Hindus hate the Muslims, and everybody hates the Jews." And here's the funny thing about this. It was a piercing song, but if you wrote that today, you'd probably start with the liberals hate the conservatives and the conservatives hate the liberals. And that wasn't part of the dialogue when he wrote this 60 years ago. But everything has changed. I mean, some of the norms, some of that is good. Some of the norms around race and religion and union membership have changed. It's not quite, hasn't gone away, but the norms have changed. And those things have changed and gone down. Identity and tribe around politics has gone up. And it shows up in some interesting ways. So in 1960, I think, Harris Polling Company asked what at the time was a strange question. They asked people, would you want your son or daughter marrying someone from the other party? And virtually everyone said, that's fine. About 5% objected. In 2010, they asked the same question, and 40% of people didn't want their kids engaged in inter-party marriages. And that was 2010. If you asked it today, I would bet it would be well over 50%. It's the new guess who's coming to dinner. And when we start asking, let me see if I can make this technology work. So the Washington Post, who I cite a number of times, did this again in 2010. They did this word cloud. They asked Democrats what they thought of Republicans, and these are the types of words that come forward. Disgusting, greedy, rich, surprising to a lot of Trump voters, terrible, crazy, confused, some good, equal to bad, But very, when you sort of piece it out, a pretty negative picture of what Republicans are. And the same thing on the other side. And again, that was 2010. Think how negative that would be. That's how we actually think of 60 million Americans who we disagree with, whatever side you're on. And that's a really a picture, I think, of what this has become. So that's where we are. And the question, I think, is, how do we get there? And many of you may think, well, look, Ken, politics is different than race. Race is what the Supreme Court would have called an immutable characteristic. Politics is different. We're different than our politics have changed over the last 25 years. Of course we dislike each other. We disagree a whole lot more. But the truth of the matter is, on issue polarization, nothing much has changed for the last 25 years. When you actually dig into the data and you look at disagreements on issues, we're actually extraordinarily stubborn people. Some issues, like hot-button issues like immigration, we actually agree more than we did 25 years ago. On some issues like gay rights, far more consensus than 15 years ago. And if you look at maybe sort of the longest running hot-button issue, abortion, and you look, which is actually a good, I'll talk about this at some length later on, you actually look at the data on it, which is Gallup is doing an annual poll on abortion ever since Roe v. Wade in 1973. We have almost a half century of annual data on it. And what is extraordinary is nothing changes. Same number of people identify themselves as pro-life, same number of people every year associate themselves as pro-choice. And roughly 48 to 53% every year say they are for abortions with some restrictions. That means different things to different people, but by and large, nothing changes. And yet, even though our views on issues haven't changed, we hate each other so much more than we used to. And that's really the puzzle of polarization. And that's actually the most important thing to understand, which is it's not about issues. We think it's our issues are right, they're wrong. That's what Andrew Wilcox say, we're right, they're wrong. Actually doesn't have anything to do with who's right or who's wrong. It's about tribe, it's about identity, and that's why it's so hard to unpack. Because you can solve issues, very hard to solve identity. But how do we get here? So I'm going to talk now about three things that have gone on, and I'm going to call them all the big sort. Actually, The Big Sort is a book by a guy named Bill Bishop, who in 2007 wrote a book called The Big Sort. It's a fabulous book about how we are physically rearranging ourselves. We also have a big sort going on in the political parties. We have a big sort going on in the media. And that is the stew that has actually driven polarization in this country. So the first one is how we're geographically reorienting ourselves. So think about this. So what Bishop noted in 2007, and is even truer today, is that people are now choosing where they live based upon politics. Democrats who move to Texas go to Austin. Republicans go to Dallas and lots of other places. You even pick micro neighborhoods. You go to Milwaukee County, for a number of reasons, but including choice. It's one of the bluest counties in the country. You walk across the line to Waukesha County, you're in the one of the most conservative counties in the country. Same people, all Milwaukeeans, but they choose neighborhoods based upon a lot of things, but including political preferences. And that means these are all mini versions of Hobart Street. In 1992, there were about 1,100 landslide counties, which are defined as counties that go for one side or the other by more than 20%, essentially non-competitive counties. It's a lot of counties, 1,100 counties. In 2016, there were 2,500 counties that were landslide counties. We have reoriented ourselves to live in politically homogeneous counties. And that means when all the people you know think like you, agree with you, it really becomes easy to demonize the other side because you don't know them. And the Washington Post, the Washington Post does a lot of great things relevant to this speech, did this extraordinary poll in 2016 in Virginia. And I still struggle with the accuracy of this, because it seems unbelievable to me. But they went into Virginia, a purple state, and they asked Clinton supporters, do you know anyone, do you have any close personal friends or family members who are voting for Trump? And then they asked Trump supporters the converse question. And think about it. Just think about how many people that, how many close personal friends or family members you have. And yet 54% of Clinton voters didn't have anyone in that set who was voting for Trump. And then 60% of Trump supporters didn't have anyone in their among close personal friends or family members who were voting for Clinton. And when I read that, I said, that can't be true. And then I had to think through myself. In fact, even though I have some Republicans in my family, none of them were supporting Trump. Everyone I knew, none of them were supporting Trump. And think about the political scientist Liliana Mason had the sort of I think the most pointed insight into this, which was, it used to be that you would go to a dinner party and you wouldn't talk about politics for fear of offending someone. Now you can go to talk about politics because it's likely that everyone's going to agree with what you think. And when we organize ourselves that way, polarization is inevitably followed because it becomes your team, their team, we all become English schoolboys. The second big sort I want to talk about is about the political parties. And again, this is not ancient history. Not very long ago, political scientists plot out every member of Congress every year based upon sort of the votes they take. And they put them on a line with the most conservative on the right, the most liberal on the left. And they plot each member of Congress based upon their votes. And not very long ago, certainly within half my lifetime, if you looked at that, most, though not all, of the most conservative members of Congress were Republicans, and most of the liberal, almost all the liberal members of Congress were Democrats. But in the middle, there was this jumble. You had conservative Democrats, liberal Republicans. And the liberal Republicans were more liberal than the conservative Democrats and vice versa. But if you look at it today, and it's been this way for the last 5 years, the most conservative member of the Democratic Party is more liberal than the most liberal member of the Republican Party. There is no overlap between the parties. They've become politically pure. And what happens when that happens? When that happens, I mean, most Americans actually are surprisingly moderate, but the parties themselves have polarized. And it has great consequences for how they think and how they act and how they talk. If you look now at the abortion issue, it's fascinating. No one has changed their mind in 20 years, in 50 years, but the political parties have. In 2016, the Democratic Party trumpeted the fact that their platform was the most pro-choice platform ever, and it was. And the Republican Party had the same proclamation that they had the most pro-life platform ever. And isn't that a little bit of a puzzle? How could the parties themselves be moving towards one extreme when the public they're supposed to curate and appeal to aren't moving at all? And that is the sort of the polarization of the parties, the sorting of the parties, and it means they're increasingly become less and less representative of the whole. And as I traveled the country, you know, it's really interesting. I mean, when we think about the populist movement in this country, in many ways, as I talk to people and try to understand Trump's success and the anger that people felt, it's because more and more people felt that the institutions of government and of the establishment didn't represent them. And when you think of the political parties moving towards the extreme, focusing on the issues of the party elites, you actually can understand why people were angered by the fact that the issues that they were pursuing didn't reflect their economic interests or their personal interests. And it came out in such interesting ways. A lot of the people who I met who voted for Trump said to me, it happened over and over in Youngstown, in Pikeville, Kentucky, in Gonzales, Texas, said, you know, I like Trump, he's different. I like the Sanders guys too. And at first it puzzled me. How could the people be interested in Trump and Sanders? You can't figure out two people who are so different, both in style and substance and ideas. But they were mold breakers. They didn't agree with the establishment. They had different rules. And it's because people felt locked out from the political process, and they gravitated towards anyone who was different, who thought could break the chain of events and open up the political dialogue in a different way. And I think that's at least an artifact of the big sort that's going on with political parties. And the final big sort is about media. I did come around to the subject of the symposium. Everywhere I went over the last year and a half, I have a background in media, as you know, but I didn't ask people about media. Everyone wanted to talk to me about media. Didn't matter who I was talking to, Republicans or Democrats. People wanted to say they thought that the media was living in the bubble. They thought the media was often had a liberal bias. They thought the media didn't know what was going on in flyover country. And there's a big conversation to have about media bias and whether it's accurate. It's a speech unto itself. But I think is undoubtedly happening in this day and age is media sorting. Because it's clear to me, and I think should be clear to everyone, that the world is sorted into pro-Trump media and anti-Trump media. You can't read, you can't watch CNN, you can't watch MSNBC, you can't watch Fox. You can't read different news sources without understanding their perspective on the president. And I spent, it was yesterday. I spent yesterday in Youngstown listening to people, mostly Trump supporters, talking about how they thought the media had a double, when they think the national media, the mainstream media, had a double standard in how they treated Trump versus how they treated Obama. And most importantly, they thought the media had an agenda that wasn't their agenda. They were talking about issues that didn't matter to them. And I had this experience today reading the Washington Post. I'm not completely obsessed with the Washington Post, circumstances notwithstanding. And there was a nice article by a guy named David Nakamura, which had the title, Elected to Lead, Not to Proofread. Clever. It was about all the mistakes that came from the president's Twitter feed and announcements from the White House, spelling mistakes, syntax mistake, factual mistakes. It was actually, I think, quite a good article, and not an unimportant one. You should have accuracy in the halls of government, certainly the most powerful house in the world. As I read it and liked it, I heard in the voices in my head the people from Youngstown saying, who cares? That's not my story. I care about jobs. I care about my community. Why are they talking about these issues? And the truth of the matter is, the issue, what we're increasingly seeing in the national media is what I would call, we're looking at sort of the economic and reputational effects of polarization. Economic effects of the Trump era, of sorting yourself into pro-Trump and anti-Trump audiences, media outlets. Donald Trump talks about the failing New York Times all the time. Donald Trump is gold for the media. CNN in an off year having the best rating year ever. The New York Times went over $1 billion in subscription revenue for the first time ever. It's driven by the narrative and the anger of the left towards Trump. And it's great for the economics. It's not so good for reputation. Oh, nope, wrong thing. All right, we're going to have, bear with me, or don't bear with me. All right, something there? Okay. So look what's happened to trust in media over the years. It's always been a challenge. Look, let's face it, it's hard to be in media. Institutions under attack, people mistrust each other. Of course, there's going to be a general institutional decline in trust as we trust each other less and less. But it's gone down steadily until 2016. It hit what I hope is rock bottom. 32% express a great deal or fair amount of trust in the media. It's actually a number lower than President Trump, if you want a standard that people shouldn't live by. But it came back. Look, first time ever, largest sort of percentage growth in the history of the survey. Is it because the media is doing a better job? Is it because it's more trusted by more Americans? Well, yes and no. It's because Democrats they've regained the trust of Democrats. Not much change with Republicans, a little change with independents, but a huge change in trust in media and Democrats, because they're increasingly doing a Democratic story. The biggest, my favorite quote from my year is a quote from Emma Roller in the New York Times, who wrote, the biggest bias in America is not liberal bias or conservative bias, it's confirmation bias. We're increasingly looking for sources that agree with us. And let's face it, look, it is a challenge in the media era, an era of economic forces that are antagonistic to media success. The Trump era has taught media, subconsciously I think, that there is power in division and power in polarization. And maybe it's an artifact of the Trump era that will last 3 years, 7 months, however long he's around. But I don't think so. Just as conservative media has learned the power of anger, the power of anger is going to drive media for the future. It's actually not such a sort of moralistic attack. It's in fact sort of, I think, an economic fact, economic reality. But look, media wasn't born with this notion of even-handed balance. It came out of political parties. In much of Europe, it still is politically driven. I think we're seeing a change in eras that is going to have consequences in terms of polarization in the future. It's a real challenge. Oh, sorry. One other slide. This is the 15, from a group called Morning Consult, the 15 most polarizing brands in America. Number 1, Trump Hotels. Number 6, the NFL. The other 13 are media brands. Fox, NBC, New York Times, MSNBC. Those are the most polarizing brands of any organization in America. Something in the media that's going to be, media's going to struggle with for the next generation, I think. So I've just told a story of polarization in America, and I didn't talk about issues. Because in fact, they're real issues, let's face it. And they're real people, oh shoot. But the challenge we have in this polarization in this country is, in fact, it's not about the issues. It's about how we organize ourselves. It's what we listen to. It's how the political parties are growing and changing and, frankly, making money. It's really hard to unpack. You can solve issues, very difficult to solve this. But what I want to encourage people to think about is, how do we deal with this? How do we deal in an era in which polarization is undermining our sense of good faith in each other, our sense of being part of a single democracy? I want to end with sort of 2 stories, which I think are a little bit more positive than what I've been talking about for the last 30 minutes or so. One of the experiences I had over the last year and a half is, as I traveled the country talking to people, I found that social media was an accelerant of polarization, and being face-to-face with people really changed the course. I talked to some strange folks, I'll say that right up front. But the vast majority of people I talked to, Trump voters, Republicans, anti-Trumpers, never-Trumpers, Sanders people, the vast majority of people I found to be reasonable and thoughtful. And when you look at things from their perspective, you really understand issues a little bit differently. When you, Lincoln talked about the bonds of affection after the Civil War. I felt those bonds of affections, not agreement, but the bonds of affection with hundreds of people who I would not know otherwise. And one of the best stories I came across was actually sort of a strange couple, a guy named Sam Adams and a guy named Kevin Palau. So Sam Adams, not the Patriot Brewer, Sam Adams is actually a historical figure of some note in the United States, the first openly gay mayor of a U.S. city, in his case, Portland, Oregon. And Sam had a little bit of a rough time being gay. Oregon, we think of Portland, very progressive city. Oregon, Portland's progressive, the rest of Oregon's not. He grew up in sort of a conservative family. He was closeted for many years. He watched Oregon go through numerous public attacks on things like teaching homosexuality in the schools, allowing homosexuals in government. And he had every right to be suspicious of the evangelical community because they were the drivers of that. But early in his tenure, he met a guy named Kevin Palau, who was actually the son of the most important evangelical in Oregon, maybe on the West Coast. And Kevin was a leader of the greater Portland evangelical community. And he had decided that he wanted the evangelical community to be known what it's for, not what it's against. So he came to the mayor, an openly gay mayor, and said, I want to partner with you. I want to take our thousands of evangelicals, mostly lived in the suburbs, and commit them to working and helping you in the city. Sam was a little suspicious. He had a lot of reasons to be suspicious. He said, but he needed help. I mean, like every city, it was under budgetary pressure. He said, okay, fine, as long as you don't proselytize, as long as no one complains, sure, I'll put you to work. And the first thing he says, look, I need help. I have a couple of inner city schools. Let's start with Roosevelt High School. Not far as the crow flies from downtown Portland and the fancy coffee shops and the rich Nike millionaires, a deeply failing inner city school. And he said, Kevin, see if you can get people to come help us just refurbish the place. Didn't really expect much to happen out of it. But on the day that it was to happen, he started getting phone calls. He said that it was saying to him that something different was going on. And at the end of the day, he drove out to Roosevelt High School. He found not what he expected, which was a handful of people coming in, check some boxes of volunteerism. Said he found hundreds of people on ladders, been all their days, been there all day, working to help improve this inner city school, none of which anyone had any connection with. And he was taken aback by this. He didn't really know what to say. But a week later at an evangelical festival that the Plows were putting on, he was invited to speak, and he got up and learned what to say. He said, let's not make this a one-day thing. Let's do this every day. And they forged actually the most important partnership, two of the sort of the odd couples of Portland, Oregon, the most important partnership of it. They invest heavily, deeply in schools. Roosevelt High School didn't have a football team because the stands were falling down. The churches rebuilt the stands. Neil Lomax, former quarterback of the St. Louis Cardinals, an evangelical, a member of one of the evangelical churches, came to be a coach of the team, which they actually eventually won the city championship. And they began this enormous partnership that actually affected a whole bunch of schools and a lot of city services. And what Sam said to me, when I talked to him and later Kevin about it, he said, listen, Kevin and I, on any 10 issues, Kevin and I are going to disagree vehemently on two. You can guess what those two are going to be. But on the other 8, we pretty much agree. Why are we spending our time focusing on the 2 when we should be talking about the 8? And that line has stuck with me throughout the year and a half of my travels. I want to read to you. I would love then to hear your questions. Sort of the final selection from my book, because it sort of sums up where I ended up on this. This book is ultimately not about who is right and who is wrong. It is about the belief that no one has a monopoly on wisdom, and that we should all be better off doing a little less finger pointing and a little more listening to the other side. just stepped on my own line. The truest thing I heard all year was from the columnist Emma Roller, who wrote, "The strongest bias in American politics is not a liberal bias. Conservative bias is a confirmation bias, or the urge to believe only things that confirm what we already believe to be true." And that bias is growing stronger as we are finding more and more ways to ensure that our media, our neighborhoods, our friends, and somehow even our families are entirely congenial to our own views. The impulse towards insulation in our society is strong, so great that some people have dreamed of entire cities of like-minded souls. In 2008, a fellow by the name of Jason Bacher, an enthusiastic acolyte of the Libertarian Congressman Ron Paul, purchased 50 acres of land outside of Del City, Texas, to create the new gated community of Paulville. The town was solely, and I quote, "for 100% Ron Paul supporters and or people who live by the ideals of freedom and liberty," and presumably shared an aversion to things like taxes and regulations and zoning and perhaps even streetlights. You might laugh at Paulville as a silly idea, and you should, but it was to be a perfection of our politically insular world where no one need be troubled by interacting with people of different views. Paulville is a metaphor for the fact that we live in a world where we have virtually unlimited access to information from all different points of views, and yet we are more and more intent on shrinking our informational horizons. Paulville is not for me, not because of disdain for libertarians or Texas, but because this year has taught me the joy of both Vox and National Review, of Sunday football and Sunday church, and of hunting for food in Whole Foods and hunting for pigs in Texas. I love Hobart Street. They haven't kicked me out because of these stories. Our neighbors are lovely. There are endless numbers of charming toddlers, and our peripatetic doves, Ginger and Doug, are returning to their occasional roost on the pillars supporting our porch. But I need a little bit of Ford Branch, Kentucky from time to time as well. We all do, because we all need to get outside our red or blue bubbles when we can. The opportunities seem less and less frequent these days. I will admit that, but it is not a lost cause. Despite the glories of the Texas scrub desert, if Bacher could find no takers for Paulville, there is still hope for us yet. So thank you for letting me speak here today.
Well, thank you so very much. We have about up to half an hour or so even for question and answers, which is terrific. If you have a question, if you come up to the microphone nearest you, we will take those in order. Close call.
So thank you very much for your talk. I appreciate, of course, who wouldn't appreciate the talk of sort of unity and coming together, all that kind of stuff. But I was wondering if you mentioned glue and unity and all these kind of stuff, and I'm wondering if someone else might say nationalism is sort of what you're saying. That there needs to be an understanding of nationalism, and yet to me, part of the inherent problem of what you're talking about is some people in the United States who are sort of liberal internationalists who see themselves as beneficiaries of Whole Foods and imports from foreign countries and living in their diverse streets, and other people who see themselves as sort of conservative nationalists, and more so in the sense that they believe that our country's ills are caused by other countries' gains. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering if perhaps, rather than talking about the unity of Americans and how we can come together, if you could perhaps comment on how a lot of people have chosen to define others as enemies. So Mexicans, Russians, or maybe Russians as friends, who depends on what your attitude towards it is. But it seems to me that there's a bigger underlying question of nationalism that you could perhaps address.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question, and thank you for that. I would say, look, a lot of the issues we face aren't new. I mean, there's always, from the beginning of the Republic, always different visions of how we interact with each other, how we, our role overseas, and that's natural in a diverse democracy. We are not going to agree on lots of things. But frankly, it's always been that case. And my plea is not that we all agree on things, because we can't and shouldn't, but it's understand that these are good faith disagreements over the course of the country. There is actually nothing, there's a lot of wrong with addiction in this country. it's actually not necessarily wrong with all the views. So this is where I get drummed out of my Haverford College and Yale Law School reunion is I spent time with Steve Bannon. Actually, the first article I wrote about the book was I got very interested in Breitbart as a media organization. I wrote an article for Vanity Fair. It was titled "The Most Important Man in Media You Never Heard of." And I woke up, it was in final edit, I woke up on vacation and he was campaign manager for Donald Trump. It was a very fast edit and right through. And you know, look, he has obviously this nationalist view of the country, one which I find often repellent, but it doesn't mean he didn't have serious issues behind it. And even take immigration. It's not necessarily all about hating the other, although there's a piece of that. It's understanding the issues. Immigration is actually at the highest rate of, in this country on a percentage basis since we actually instituted some limits on immigration in the beginning of the 20th century. And it's not fundamentally wrong to raise those issues. It's fundamentally wrong to raise them in the way they have. And that's what I think the conversation should be about. Not about who's right or wrong, because we should engage on those issues, but how we deal with each other. So I don't expect people to necessarily agree on immigration. Actually, very different points of view, many of them reasonable. But it's a notion that just because we disagree, because we have different views of globalism or nationalism, of raising our borders or lowering our borders. We've had those fights for 150 years. But those fights have now become existential, because we think the other side is not just wrong, but morally corrupt. And that's really the concern I have.
I appreciate the talk. It's very interesting. I'm part of the way through the book right now.
All right. Keep going. Actually, if you already bought it, it doesn't matter, you know.
I said I was part of the way through his book, but I haven't finished it yet. So, but you might have addressed this in a latter part of the book. But I'm just curious to know your opinions about the level of discourse today, particularly in the age of social media. I feel like a lot of times people get online and they yell at each other online, or on through their Facebook pages,
yeah.
And that might not necessarily be how they talk to each other in person. So, or maybe it is, I don't know. But yeah. I feel like there's a big disconnect, or a big, two separate worlds. So
yeah.
Just see if you can comment a little bit on that.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And I do write about that in the later stages of the book, so keep going. I've learned to hate social media. I mean, one of the experiences I had is like face-to-face. People are incredibly reasonable, often thoughtful, almost never belligerent. Sometimes, but almost never. On social media, it's like the reverse. It gives people sort of that cloak of anonymity. I was sitting next to Dr. Ping at dinner, and we were talking about this, and he said, well, Plato wrote about that. That's probably a little bit more academic and thoughtful than I can do. But it's that notion, that cloak of invisibility that Plato wrote about, that when we're anonymous, we can say almost what we want, anything we want. And I wrote in the book, if it wasn't for Wikipedia and Uber, I'd throw my phone out the window today. I actually experienced some of this. I'm not a public figure. There are people who get far more hate every day. But when my book came out, I got lots of hate mail on Twitter from people who clearly had never read the book, who judged the book by its cover, which I think I was taught not to do in second grade. And attacks one way, and then attacks actually from neo-Nazis about other things. And it's really sort of an extraordinary lesson. I don't think people would ever say those things face to face. But the distance, sort of the bravery of social media, I think is really coarsened and corrupted the conversation in this country. Not entirely sure what to do with that, but I think it's enormously worrisome.
Thank you for being here today. I'm actually in a contemporary history seminar class, and a few weeks ago we read your book and we discussed it.
God, I love this school. I mean, this is great.
So
thank you.
So my question really is, when you got back to your neighborhood
yeah.
from your travels across the country,
yeah.
what was their reaction to the other side? Was there some understanding? Was there still some push away? What was sort of
Well, I am not
your
welcome
neighbor's
on
reaction?
Hobart Street. Funny, I'm barely welcome in my house. So, and I'm actually not entirely joking on that point, sort of joking. Like I said, my wife is a hardcore Democrat. My 10-year-old son is even harder core. He's sure the Democrats are right. He's sure the Republicans are wrong. It's actually a pretty good lesson because he couldn't tell you anything about them, but he knows what one side is right and the other. And my first appearance on TV, when my book came out, he booed me.
That's natural.
And I think, again, everything's a metaphor. I just think, it's like people don't want to hear sort of the message that in this day and age that, there is wisdom on the other side. We can learn something from listening to each other. It's a very hard message in which we're continually told, again, we're right, they're wrong. I mean, when I think of Hillary Clinton going to India and describing the 62 million people who voted against her as racist, backwards looking, or under the control of their husbands, brothers, or sons, I think a lot of people actually agree with that. And it might be in politic, especially if you want to persuade 62 million, any of those 62 million voters to vote the other way in the next election. But I think it reflects a real sense of where things at.
Well, I did read your book, and I signed it, so I expect a kickback at the end.
You got
of
it.
But it's a wonderful book, and in parts of it, it's quite lyrical when you're talking about Appalachia. Yeah. And who can object to a plea for reasonableness in an unreasonable age? One of the things you really don't talk about is the structural drivers of polarization. You talked about how people have sorted themselves out, and that's true. But there's something about media, not just social media, but regular media, that drives the politics towards extremes, because those extremes vote and they turn out for primaries. Yeah. And they primary people if they don't have authenticity or if they don't have ideological purity. And I'm not sure that can be turned off, even with a plea to reasonableness, or even if you could somehow magically sort people back into more purplish districts. Yeah. That it may be true that views on abortion have not changed, but the people who will come out and vote specifically on abortion will do so in large enough numbers that they can drive the politics towards the edges in both parties.
Right.
How do you fix that? A plea to reasonableness won't do anything at all about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm good at pointing out the problem, less good at pointing out the solution. It's a writer's privilege. I think these are very hard, intractable issues, and they're systemic, as you say. And I think a lot on the party side is like who turns out, who are the intense interests, who controls the primary system. I think it's probably true that a lot of Republicans on Capitol Hill are appalled by the president and know if they say it, they'll be punished, which is why Corker and Flake and Charlie Dent aren't running for re-election and feel like they are finally empowered to say things. I'm not sure I agree on the redistricting, the gerrymandering issue. I mean, I think part of it is structural in the sense that there is, these are safe seats and really is about the primaries. I think it changes a little bit if gerrymandering changes. And I think it's going to show Pennsylvania is going to be an interesting year because of that. And I think one of the things I want to follow closely is sort of how the Supreme Court rules on gerrymandering, because I think closer districts encourage different behaviors on the part of politicians. You can win the primary, but if you're going to blow up in the general, it's going to change things quite a bit. I hope. Hi.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for coming and speaking to us. I wanted to ask you, as someone who has an extensive experience in media, you talked a little bit about this kind of divide where people only trust the message that they're being delivered that they kind of want, their confirmation bias. And I guess from a practical standpoint, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the tension in places like NPR between that kind of push to have greater viewership or greater listenership, and also the desire to create that more inclusive public square where people from both sides are interested in listening to the same source of information. And also if you just have any sort of prescriptive recommendations going forward about how that would be improved.
I wish you hadn't asked that last part. So I think it's a really interesting question and a complicated one. Because, and I've written about this and tried to say, I made myself unpopular with some of my colleagues at NPR by talking about the bubbles that we all live in. My book is about bubbles, and I was making the point that media lives in bubbles as well. And I tried to say, you can on one hand say there's great journalism going on, people are dedicated to the craft, and yet there's also the subconscious effect of the fact that they live, work, and talk to people who agree with them every day. And layered on top of that, now I think is more and more the economic. So I think that's always the case. It's just us as our nature as human beings. And layer on top now, I think, is a clear economic message that division and polarization, super serving your audience, really works. One of the things I follow, I spend too much time on message boards, reading sort of comments. It's really, if you want a quick trip towards insanity, spend time on the Breitbart comment boards, spend time on a lot of comment boards. And the Washington Post actually has sort of this interesting experiment where they have the publisher of the Hillsdale, Ohio newspaper write an irregular column. And the Hillsdale, Ohio, called the Tribune, Town Gazette, was one of the handful of papers, I think, along with Las Vegas Sentinel, who endorsed Donald Trump in 2016. And he writes a column sort of from flyover country trying to describe what it's like. You can like or dislike the columns, you think it's good or bad. But I think it's sort of an effort, sort of a laudable effort to show a different perspective. And if you read the comments on it, it's like the end of times. It's like the audience, you know who the audience, the motivated audience of the Washington Post is because they are blasting the guy. Not just for what he writes, but for who he is. And I think it's a clear message to media outlets that you better, people are flocking to you because of your point of view. Don't violate that, or you risk alienating the audience. I think we can't ignore the economic certainty of this. And I think we just have to figure out how do we live in a world in which media outlets are going to increasingly. Doesn't mean that there aren't great journalists. I mean, in some ways, this is the golden age of journalism, doing great work. But media outlets are more and more going to be reflecting the views and interests of their audiences in ways that I think are a little bit different when the days when I think media outlets actually dictated the conversation more than reflected it. Yes, sir.
You point out what I think a lot of people would probably consider, sort of an axiomatic truth that politics has always been contentious. That there ever since the beginning of the Republic. But I think on most issues you're absolutely right about that there hasn't been any fundamental sort of seismic shifts. But in certain ways, right? I'm just going to pull one example, a major one. On certain major issues, there are sort of major political realignments happening, which I think might be contributing to the sort of rush towards polarization on both ends, right? So we're having for the first time since I think the early Cold War, at the very beginnings of the Cold War, fundamental debates about foreign policy, for instance, the extent of sort of globalist internationalism, that sort of thing, right? And actual fundamental debates in a way that we haven't fundamentally had since the late 1940s, let's say, early 1950s. And there's a few other examples you can choose, on along that line. But do you think there's anything to the idea that we might actually be undergoing sort of fundamental political realignments, both within parties and even sort of cross-party, sort of on economics, right? Ideas about what the welfare state should look like is not necessarily just a Democratic versus Republican thing. So I don't know to what extent you find that a factor or not.
So it's an interesting set of things I'm going to answer, and then actually, I think go in a different direction. So I think, you're raising the notion that the liberal post-war consensus is cracking. Sort of this liberal, globalist, free trade, which has never been uniform, but is been more and more uniform among the parties over the last 50 years. I think that has shown cracks. There's always been, look, Dick Gephardt ran for president entirely on a fair trade platform. It used to be a democratic pro-union issue. There's always been, never been uniformity, but I do think there's a much bolder attack on that consensus than there used to be. I think that's part of what's going on. But I would say, that the question, what interests me about the question is, reminds me of a conversation that I was at with a guy named Morris Fiorina, who is one of the better political sciences country. He teaches at Stanford. And he came to an event I was at, mostly Stanford Hoover Institute, had a dinner for him, his new book out on independence, which I recommend, his book. And he walked in, sat down, it was mostly journalists there, and he looked at them and said, "You all are very strange." Because the conversation you're having about politics, about policy, the question you had, not a question that people in the country have. You go to Youngstown, you go to Pikeville, Kentucky, that's not the conversation people have. I mean, I think the populism in this country is driven largely by economic inequality or inequity and the sense of a loss of ambition. The notion, if you look at, this is about populism, if you look at sense of hope for the future among the white working class, compared to any other group in the country, the educated, blacks, Hispanics, way down. And I think it's largely, it's not because of globalism or not globalism. It's not because of social issues. It's largely about sort of the loss of economic sense, the sense that the opportunity for their children are going to be better than they had. And that's really that story. I think a lot of this is window dressing on that fundamental issue of the sense that the American dream is not their dream anymore.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here for this conference. I'm here to actually promote another conference,
Right.
but I'll ask you to comment a little bit too.
It's a fabulous conference you're promoting. How's
Thank
that
you.
for comment?
We did pretty well on this one, so that's good. In a couple of weeks, we will have the Schoeneman Symposium for Photojournalism and New Media, and the theme this year is covering Trump. So looking at how the media are trying to make sense of something that's been a challenge to make sense. Yeah. On Tuesday evening, April 10th, we will have, we'll feature the Washington Post year-long photojournalism series called What Unites Us. It's actually phrased as a question. I don't know if you saw that series, but something
Despite my obsession with the Washington Post, I didn't see that.
So I would refer you to it, and everybody else, I would refer you to it, and then come on April 10th, and that evening, the people who were behind that project will be speaking here. We'll actually have an all-day conference on the 10th and the 11th on covering Trump. But that evening, I would especially invite you to, and you might want to take a look at that.
All right, thanks.
They're trying to make sense of
fantastic.
What is it that does unite us still.
Yeah, cool.
Thanks for coming to speak. I was curious about the example you gave of the two gentlemen in Portland, and how we could...
Sam and Kevin, yeah.
What's that?
Sam and Kevin.
Sam and Kevin?
Yeah.
And how we could encourage more of that, particularly when it's often claimed that the incentive is for negative ads or negative like attack ads. And so how can we get politicians to, how can we have the right incentives for us to be more focused on those 8 issues that we agree on and affect positive change for our communities when it seems like psychologically our society and our voters are much more responsive to the negative?
So it's an interesting set of questions. So there's a lot of diction, and I spent 45 minutes talking about how angry we are at each other. But there are also some contrary trends. There's a slide I have which I actually didn't put up, which I think is actually one of the most interesting undernoted trends in this country, which is the rise of independence. So if you turn the clock back 30 years, most people, the largest group of people were Democrats by far. Second were Republicans, and third were independents. And over the last 30 years, that's actually changed. So this is probably the year that more people self-identify as independents than Democrats and Republicans combined. It's been about 46%, as high as 46%. And that's driven, I think, not the fact that people are becoming increasingly moderate, people are actually changing their views. I think there's growing groups of people who are actually embarrassed by the politics of today. They're still Democrats or they're still Republicans, they just don't want to admit it. So they vote that way, but they won't identify themselves that. And I think that's a group of people, call them almost the almost silent majority, or the silent almost majority. And I think there's a question of sort of how do you tap into those folks who I think are increasingly concerned about the diction of our dialogue. It's interesting, Trump's probably most popular moment in 15 months was when he sat down with Chuck and Nancy. and actually did a deal that went around the Republicans. That was actually uniformly popular with people across the country. And it was extraordinary to me that he actually didn't grab that. He may not want to be popular. He may just want to be to his base. Got him elected the first time. But I think there's a message in there for politicians ultimately. If we can figure out how to deal with that primary issue that you mentioned, because I think in the general election, compromise, taking the best ideas from both sides, actually rewarded. I think that was rewarded in the Pennsylvania 18th. I think it will be rewarded if other politicians can figure out how to get through the primary process and get to the general.
Thank you for coming to speak today. A few weeks ago, I was listening to a program on NPR about the Libertarian Party. Yeah. And I was wondering if you think some of this polarization in America could be helped by having more parties that are other choices besides Republicans and Democrats. If we had more teams to choose from, perhaps some of this polarization could be solved. And if you think maybe some of this polarization will lead to the rise of parties such as the Libertarian Party.
So that's a really good question. I think there's some potential there. I think there's some potential for realignment of the parties because they're not reflecting. I mean, the public view of the parties are so low. And I talked about how low the public view of the media is. Public view of both parties is actually even lower. I mean, you could actually have a lot of fun with it because there are diseases that are more popular than the political parties, and I'm not making that up. I actually wrote an article for Vanity Fair that I think this is 2020 is actually the year in which not necessarily a libertarian, but perhaps an independent will actually be the most could be a serious candidate for president at least in at least a century. Think about how unpopular both parties are. Donald Trump on the day he got elected was the most unpopular presidential candidate, major party candidate in recorded history. Hillary Clinton was number 2. There is an opening, I think. This question is who can exploit it for someone who speaks because of the unpopularity of the parties, the unpopularity of the process. There is an opening in 2020 that I think is different than ever before. Think about, Ross Perot, when he ran for president in 1992, at a time when the political parties were far more popular, and frankly the major party candidates were far more credible. Ross Perot entered the race, immediately jumped to the top of the polls, dropped out of he's a strange character. He dropped out of the race in July, re-entered in October, and still got 22% of the vote. The conditions are much riper now for that type of third party or independent candidate. And the question is, will anyone step up and take advantage of it?
I have found your, points about the lack of trust in the media really interesting, and I was wondering if you could talk about whether or not you think that's because the media is becoming more polarized itself, or if it has something to do with just public perception, and if the former, what impact, if any, do you think repealing the fairness doctrine had back in the 80s?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. You guys ask good questions, and I mean that. So look, there's a long-term, it's a complicated stew, I think, of the reputation of the media. Some of it is clearly outside of its control. There's a long-term systematic decline in trust in institutions that the media can't swim against. Frankly, there are a lot of ridiculous, unfair attacks on the media that corrodes its reputation regardless of the accuracy of it. But truthfully, there's a third factor that I think the media is not grappled with, which is its insularity and often arrogance. And that plays through, and people notice it, and makes people angry. And I think that's part of the challenge that media has in this age. I think the fairness doctrine clearly has had a role in that. We live in a wild west of media. I think we probably still, because of social media and digital media, which is all outside the control of the FCC anyway, we probably have that wild west anyway. But the breakdown in sort of norms of fairness, the opportunity to show things, the requirement to show things from the other side, I think has opened up Pandora's box in a certain way. And I don't think it matters anymore. The fairness doctrine is not coming back. If it did, it wouldn't matter, because that's not how people don't get their news principally through FCC governed outlets anymore. Cable, digital, you name it, most of it's not affected by the fairness doctrine anyway.
You've gestured a couple times towards how economics are fueling media sort or media segmentation, however you want to refer to that. Could you explain a little bit more what you're talking about? Like, what are those economic forces that are contributing to media sort? And I'm thinking specifically in terms of, the crisis in the business model that a lot of media organizations, newspapers in particular, have faced past 10 or 15 years. And then the last piece, can we combat those at all? Is there anything that we can do to counter those economic forces?
So the frame on that is the news media has just gone through probably the worst 25 years in its history. The basic breakdown of the newspaper model has been extraordinary. I mean, it's led to the decline in audience, decline in newsroom, decline in revenue. Is really, and that's not really changed. There are plenty of media outlets that are still under pressure and may not survive. A lot of local newspapers being chief among those. But there's a clear lesson. I mean, and part of that is, the opportunity to spend advertising dollars in a lot of different places, but it's also caused about the fracturing of the audience. I mean, the audience for CNN's gone down. The audience for most national newspapers have gone down. The audience for virtually every major media outlet has gone down until the last year or so. CNN, I mentioned earlier, CNN has its best year ever in an off year. It just doesn't happen that way. And it's because people in their core audience, and in the grand scheme of things, it's a pretty small audience. We're talking about a couple million people in a country of 320 million people. They can't get enough of Donald Trump. They may say they can. They may say it's driving them nuts. They may hate him, but they can't get enough of that story. And that's why if you go to MSNBC, I've been told reasonably reliably, that the shows of the cable networks basically are under orders cover nothing but Donald Trump unless there's a breaking news story. And you can go insane that way, but you can also build audience, and audience equal dollars. And that's because people are angry. And rightly so. But there's a lesson in that, that anger sells. The conservative media has learned it decades ago. It's what Rush is about. It's what Mark Levin is about. It's what Breitbart is about. It's what Fox is about. They learned the lesson, and it's finally trickled down to the mainstream media. It's because the mainstream media is legitimately angry at Trump, it reflects their interests, but when Trump leaves, that lesson's going to remain. And I think we're just going to have to get used to the world in which media is not really trying to be center, but really reflecting the interests and the anger of and maybe even flogging the interests of their audience.
As you said at some point in your talk, you could do a whole other talk on just the media elements of this. So I don't want to get too far into it. But to the point of the last two questions, I've been a reporter in Washington since mid-2016, and so I definitely identify with a lot of what you're saying about bubbles. I live near King Street, so you can imagine what it's like, right? Yeah. Just as a clarification, what you're saying about revenue models and what you're saying about advertising in the last year is definitely true at, say, the New York Times or CNN. Obviously, it continues to go down and get worse, frankly, everywhere else in the country. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, there are more reporters than ever before in Washington and New York, but of course less than ever before in the rest of the country. And so what I was wondering is, you're talking about the insularity. You're obviously we're seeing these headlines that spread across Facebook or something. They're typically generated in New York or in Washington or in Los Angeles. And so we see them nationally, and we see them in rural Ohio, for example, but they're coming from, to your point, these insular places with the confirmation bias issue. When you were in Youngstown or somewhere else, did you pay attention, and you might talk about this in the book, and I will absolutely read it now, but did you pay attention to how you saw those kinds of outlets cover the president, or how you see them talk about Trump or these issues? And I guess the last piece of that, like you were saying, journalists from New York and DC have a certain kind of conversation about these issues. Did you think journalists that still work and live in the rest of the country actually talk about things not like populism is a weird political science debate, but as, what does the steel tariff mean? Like, how does that affect the community? That kind of thing.
So there are a lot of And again, you could do a whole different lecture on that. There are a lot of cross currents there. So I mean, I'm an alumni of NPR. NPR is a little different than others in the sense it has public radio stations around the country and actually has journalists who live in those communities. But they have their own conversational bubble. The public radio attracts a certain type of individual, and it's a self-perpetuating organization that tends to hire more people like themselves politically. So that's, I think geographic distribution is important, but it doesn't solve everything. I sat in Youngstown at the Yankee restaurant, the Yankee Diner, yesterday morning with the editor of the Vindy, the Youngstown Vindicator, and lamented the challenge that local newspaper is having. The Vindy was in front of us, stories about whether home goods would bring 1,100 jobs to Youngstown, about 1,500 people showing up at one of the suburban school board meetings. 1,500 people. It was actually an amazing story. You don't get reports like that anywhere except from local reporters, and it's a beautiful thing. But we also talked about how the VID is really under enormous financial pressures. They don't do a lot of, and they have a columnist who talks about national politics and really how it applies to Mahoning County and Trumbull County, but they leave the national reporting to the national outlets because there's no, their newsroom can't survive, can barely survive doing local reporting. And I think that's a real challenge in every single local market in this country.
We'll
Hello.
take that as the final question.
Yes, looks like it. Former English schoolboy, asking you to possibly to broaden it a bit at the end. This time last week I was at the National Theatre in London, actually on stage because it was an interactive performance of Network. Bryan Cranston appearing as Howard Beale, restaging the '76 movie about people who are angry and mad as hell and so on. And the pitch was obviously Trumpian, but it was relating also to events in the UK and more widely in 2016. So I wonder how much of the things you've been describing this evening are particular to the US or uniquely American, and how much this is an international phenomenon.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. I don't have a good answer because I haven't done any reporting on that. But I suspect it is not limited to the United States. I mean, England went through Brexit and its own sort of populist movement. You saw this relative success of Marine Le Pen in France. There are populist parties everywhere, and I think the same engines driving populism and dislocation in the United States are working maybe to a lesser degree elsewhere. Economic dislocation, the big sort of populations and media, and political parties were already more differentiated overseas anyways, in Europe anyways. But I think you see it may be a US disease, maybe not, but you certainly see the spread of the virus in other countries. And I think that's probably most of the factors that work here probably apply in Europe as well. I don't know that. It's my speculation. You probably know more about than I do. But I suspect that that's a common occurrence. I haven't spoken to Steve Bannon since he left the White House, but I've emailed with him. And he's off. I mean, his job now is spreading the populist message to Europe. He was actually in China. I can't imagine what he was allowed to do in China. But that's his mission in his post-White House phase, which is the spread of the populist nationalist messages around the world. Because that's his vision of the world is countries, it's not just about the United States, it's about countries with strong borders, strong national identities. That's what makes the world better. And he's working, I think, on that vision with like-minded people in Europe and beyond.
Well, I want to thank you very much for the introduction
me.
to these issues and the thought-provoking speech and questions and answers in particular. And I want to invite you all again to take up some of these tomorrow at 10 a.m., if you're up that early, on the national media at 1 p.m. on regional perspectives, regional media, and 3-ish, saying, on Brexit and on, in fact, the sort of global resurgence of populism over in Nelson Commons. Thank you very much.